The passenger. Imagine getting on the last bus of the night, looking at the back and realizing there's always someone sitting there. No one approaches him. The seat next to him remains eternally empty. The smell, the same smell of wilted flowers and unlit funeral candles. He never speaks, never shows his face, and always disappears at the final stop without anyone seeing him leave. But one night, he broke the silence, and what he said was terrifying. "I just want to tell you how I died." If you like true stories or urban legends that chill your blood, you've already leave the like now. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because today you'll learn about the legend of the passenger at the back of the bus. And maybe after this you'll think twice before looking back on your next night trip. It was always in the late hours of the day, when the city seemed to have forgotten its own inhabitants, that bus line came to life. The clock was passing 11:30 at night, and the stops were becoming increasingly empty. There was no lively conversation, no rush of workers, only lonely, weary figures silently awaiting the transport that would take them back to cold homes, dimly lit streets, and interrupted dreams. The drivers called that trip the Phantom Line, not because it had been abandoned, but because the silence that accompanied it carried the weight of mourning. The bus continued its journey through forgotten neighborhoods, poorly paved hills, and dark squares where only the lit streetlights flickered like cemetery candles. Inside the bus, the interior lights flickered from time to time, and the engine sounded muffled, as if even it was afraid to break the silence. It was in this scenario that some passengers began to notice a detail. Always, every night, as the clock approached midnight, he appeared. It didn't matter if there was just one lady returning from work or 10 young people scattered in nervous conversation. The last passenger always appeared. He walked slowly down the aisle, dragging his feet as if carrying an invisible weight, until he chose the same seat, the seat at the far end, against the window. The strange thing wasn't just his constant presence, but the fact that no one could remember him getting on. Passengers claimed they hadn't seen him get on. The driver said he hadn't registered his arrival. Yet, when the bus pulled away, there he was, sitting motionless, his body hunched over and his head lowered, as if hiding behind a veil. His breathing was unheard. His hands weren't visible. He was just a dark figure, always present, always distant. And, curiously, no one ever sat next to him. It didn't matter if the bus was nearly full. That seat remained empty, as if it were a place reserved for something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Superstitious drivers avoided looking in the rearview mirror for too long. Some said that when they did, they had the strange sensation that their passengers' eyes were staring back at them, even though their face remained hidden. Others swore they heard low whispers like moans, mingling with the engine's roar. The bus continued down street after street, lit by flickering streetlights and shuttered storefronts. Inside, the air was dense, almost cold, despite the heat of the summer mornings. For the few who dared to face the back, the sensation was unique, as if that man, if indeed he was a man, wasn't just traveling, he was waiting, and every night he got off last, not through the front door, not the side door. He simply wasn't there when the bus stopped at the final stop. An empty bench, the lingering smell of a wake, and a silence that followed the driver for the rest of the night. This was the scenario on the night train. A common route for those returning home, but a portal of unease for those who unwittingly shared the journey with the passenger at the back. Older drivers were no longer surprised to see him in the back, but there was something even the most hardened drivers couldn't stand. The smell. It was unmistakable. Every time the passenger in the back appeared, the air inside the bus changed. It wasn't just a common odor, like end-of-day sweat or the mixture of gasoline and dust that permeated the worn pews. It was heavier, more symbolic. A sweet, cloying smell, reminiscent of wilted flowers mixed with the cheap scent of burnt incense. The same aroma that fills small chapels when the body lies in a coffin, surrounded by wreaths of faded flowers. The smell of a wake. At first, some passengers thought it was coming from the vehicle itself, as if it were the result of old upholstery, wet from the rain and left to dry in the sun. But as soon as the stranger appeared, the odor intensified, gathering deep inside, around him, as if it were part of his very essence. Ticket collectors reported that when they passed by to collect tickets, they felt a sudden nausea. Their stomachs churned, and a pressure in their chest made them move quickly away. Some even coughed, as if the air had become too dense. Curiously, whenever they returned to the center of the bus, the smell diminished, as if confined to an invisible space around that passenger. Reports began to spread. Students said they couldn't concentrate on reading when he was present because the odor seemed to permeate the pages of their notebooks. Tired workers claimed that when they tried to doze off, they woke up suffocating, as if breathing in a closed room filled with dead flowers. Some even tried to explain it rationally. Perhaps he was homeless, carrying on his clothes the smell of some dirty place permeated by smoke or mold. But this explanation quickly fell apart. No one ever saw him in torn clothes. He always wore something dark, simple but intact, with no signs of dirt or wear. It was as if he were eternally ready for a funeral. The most disturbing thing was that the smell didn't disappear with him. When he reached the final stop and the back seat was empty, the physical presence disappeared, but the odor lingered for a few minutes, lingering in the air like a bitter memory. The drivers, disturbed, would even open all the windows and roll the empty vehicle back to the parking lot, trying to dissipate the trail that seemed to cling to the walls. Over time, it became a sign. Just a whiff of it was enough to know he was there, even before noticing him sitting down. The funeral perfume preceded his arrival like a silent warning, a kind of olfactory trail announcing the inevitable. That night, the passenger in the back would travel again. Some drivers swore they could smell it even during daytime shifts, when the bus was crowded and noisy. And when they looked in the rearview mirror, the seat in the back was empty. But for a moment, just for a moment, they seemed to see a shadow there, motionless. The scent became his signature, his invisible mark. For everyone who ever stepped onto that line, just one smell was enough to understand they weren't alone. Even if no one dared to look back, it was always like this. Everyone got on first. The lady returning from cleaning, the young student with headphones, the night security guard exhausted after 12 hours on his feet. The bus would wait a few seconds at the stop, and when it seemed like no one else was going to get on, it appeared. No one remembered seeing him rush in to catch the bus. They never saw him rush around a corner or cross the street. He simply appeared. One second there was nothing. The next he was there at the back door, waiting in silence. The most attentive drivers claimed they didn't remember seeing him approach. They only noticed his presence when their gaze involuntarily fell on the inside mirror and saw him walking down the aisle, slowly, as if in no hurry. He shuffled his feet, and the sound echoed disproportionately. It wasn't the typical squeak of shoes on the worn bus floor. It was deeper, almost metallic, as if each step were accompanied by a distant echo. Some passengers reported feeling the floor vibrate slightly as he passed, as if carrying an invisible weight, and then, invariably, she'd head to the back. I didn't choose another seat, it didn't vary. Always the same bench, in the corner against the window. She'd sit with her head down, her shoulders slumped, as if carrying ancient burdens. She never used her cell phone, never fumbled with her pockets, never interacted with anyone. She simply existed in that space. The most disturbing thing was what happened to the other passengers. Even when the bus was packed, with people jostling and standing in the aisle, the seat next to him remained empty. It was as if an invisible wall surrounded him, a field of repulsion that warded off any attempt to approach. Those who dared to sit down would rise a few seconds later in a cold sweat, with chest pains or inexplicable anguish, as if swallowed by a presence not of this world. Once, a teenager, mocking the legend, decided to take the seat. He laughed, joked, said he didn't believe any of it, but less than 2 minutes later, he staggered to his feet, his face pale, his lips purple, as if the air had vanished around him. He stumbled out the middle door and was never seen in that row again. Over time, the ritual took hold. Passengers no longer needed to look at each other to understand. That seat was off limits. The silence that accompanied his entrance was suffocating, and the entire bus seemed to enter a different rhythm when he sat down. And there was one more detail. He was never the first to enter. He always waited. He always observed, even if no one dared look up to confirm. Only after everyone was settled did he make his final entrance, as if he had the right to end the act of each journey. He was the last passenger, but he didn't look like someone looking for transportation. His posture said something else. It said he was looking for something, or someone. And night after night, he would repeat the same ritual, as if each departure were a new chance to fulfill an interrupted destiny. At the back of the bus, that lonely seat next to him had become forbidden territory. There was no sign, notice, or marking to justify it, but everyone knew it. The seat was always clean, untouched, as if it had never been used, and even the most skeptical upon approaching felt an invisible resistance. The empty seat became a silent pact between passengers and drivers. No one dared break the unwritten rule. The mere thought of occupying that space sent shivers down your spine, as if your entire body rejected the idea before it even occurred. It was a primal instinct, a self-preservation that came from within, like when you walk away from a cliff without thinking. Those who took the risk, however, discovered why. There was a story told repeatedly among drivers. A nurse, exhausted after a shift, entered the nearly empty bus. Without paying attention, she walked to the back and sat next to him. At first, nothing happened, but minutes later, the woman began to feel the thin air, as if she were in a closed, unventilated room. She tried to adjust herself, but the sensation only worsened. Her breath became shallow, her chest tight, and when she finally looked up, she swore she saw a shadow leaning over her, even though the passenger hadn't moved. In desperation, she got up and ran to the front of the bus, trembling, murmuring that the cold was coming from inside his skin. Others reported similar symptoms. Sudden chills, sharp headaches, palpitations, even nausea would appear without explanation. It was as if the body was reacting to a presence incompatible with life. The curious thing was that it wasn't just physical discomfort. Many said they felt something more, something spiritual, a deep sadness, a sense of mourning, as if they had just lost someone dear. Some even cried for no reason, tears falling silently as they remained for a few moments beside him. The empty seat became a symbol of respect. Older passengers made a point of warning newcomers, "Don't sit there." Some said it seriously, others with nervous laughter, but everyone knew the warning was true. Even the ticket collectors, when the bus was full, preferred to squeeze in, standing next to the turnstile, rather than suggest anyone take that space. For the superstitious, this was a clear sign. The seat was reserved, not for the living, but for the afterlife. For others, it was proof that the passenger in the back was not there as an ordinary traveler, but as a spirit in search of something. Someone brave enough to sit next to him and listen to what he had to say, but nobody had. And so, night after night, the scene repeated itself. The bus might be packed, with people standing, bodies crammed together, breathing heavily, and there in the back, he, motionless, taking up his space, with an eternally empty seat beside him. A seat that wasn't meant to be filled. And, little by little, the passengers began to realize that seat wasn't empty by chance. I was waiting for someone. The story began to circulate among the bus company's employees like a cursed secret. Whoever told it always lowered their voices, as if afraid the passenger might hear it, even from a distance. It was about a new conductor, called only Pedro, who had been working on the night route for a few weeks. Pedro was young, full of energy, and laughed at the stories his classmates told. He dismissed it all as superstition, saying it was something for overtired people. He even scoffed, claiming the passenger in the back was probably just a homeless man with a strong odor or a strange old man who liked to scare people. He didn't believe in curses, much less ghosts. On a muggy Friday morning, Pedro took his position next to the turnstile. The bus was nearly empty, with only 3 passengers scattered across the front seats. The bus stopped in a dark spot near a square, and as always, he appeared. Pedro watched him in the rearview mirror, a tall, thin man, wrapped in dark clothes that clashed with the night heat. He climbed in silently, shuffling his feet, and headed toward the back. The distinctive smell soon filled the air, and the other passengers began to shift uneasily. "Hey, buddy," Pedro said, trying to sound friendly. "Where are you going? I need your ticket." No response. The conductor, impatient, stood up and walked to the back. The air seemed heavier with each step, as if he were entering a different space, isolated from the rest of the bus. When he reached the passenger's side, he repeated firmly, "You need to pay for the ticket." It was then that the man slowly raised his head. Pedro expected to see an ordinary face, perhaps tired, perhaps closed, but what he saw could not be clearly described later. The face seemed covered in an impossible shadow, even under the direct light from the lamp above the bench. There were no defined features, only a dark void, as if the place where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been had been swallowed by nothingness. Pedro froze. For a moment he thought he was fainting. He felt short of breath, his skin crawling, his stomach churning. An intense chill ran down his spine. The entire bus seemed to have gone completely silent. No engine, no street noise, nothing. Just that emptiness before him. Without a word, Pedro took a few steps back, stumbling into the aisle. He ran back to the turnstile, pale, his body trembling. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror and knew immediately. Pedro had seen what everyone else was avoiding. That night, the young conductor couldn't continue his shift. He asked to get off at the next stop and never wanted to work that line again. His colleagues commented that he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, saying he could still feel the passenger's empty gaze haunting him. The story spread, and after that, no conductor ever tried to collect the man's fare. Again, he would climb up, sit in the back, and no one dared approach. It was as if everyone had accepted that he didn't belong to the rules of the living, and from that day on, the legend ceased to be just a curiosity. It became an indisputable truth among drivers and conductors. The passenger in the back wasn't just a strange traveler. He was something not to be bothered with. Over time, drivers realized that the passenger in the back didn't need to move or speak to dominate the environment. His mere presence altered the atmosphere of each trip. All he had to do was climb the steps and settle into the same seat in the corner, and the entire bus would be swallowed by an unnatural silence. It was as if all familiar sounds lost their power. The engine's steady roar became distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. The hum of the interior light's electrical wiring faded. Even the metallic thud of the wheels on the asphalt seemed to dissolve into the heavy air. What remained was only a dense, palpable silence, making the passengers glance at each other in nervous discomfort. Some tried to break the awkwardness. Students whispered jokes. Workers tried to start small talk, but their voices didn't come out as they used to. Ordinary words sounded quieter, as if swallowed by the space around them. They soon gave up, returning to silence, their eyes fixed on the ground or on their phones, avoiding looking back. Drivers described the sensation as like driving inside a moving tomb. "The bus gets heavy," they said. Not physically, but spiritually. At every turn, it felt like something invisible sat on their shoulders, pressing down on their chests, squeezing air out of them. Many ended their shift exhausted, as if they'd carried a burden beyond their job. The most disturbing thing was when the silence became absolute. There were nights when, after a passenger boarded, it seemed as if the world outside had stopped. Cars passing by on the street disappeared soundlessly. The barking of dogs in the backyards was inaudible, not even the wind in the trees. The bus became a cocoon of moving darkness, with all eyes focused forward, feigning normality, while the back of the vehicle exuded an invisible presence no one wanted to confront. Some passengers said that at these moments they heard something else. It wasn't complete silence, but rather a distant sound, like a lament, a muffled cry perhaps, or murmurs in an incomprehensible language, mingled with the sweet scent of dead flowers. The sound didn't come from outside, it came from within, from deep within. An elderly woman who regularly boarded that line once said that the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a calling. "It's the silence of the dead," she whispered to the driver one night before getting off at the next stop without looking back. The passenger never moved. He remained motionless, like part of the bus's structure. But with every minute, with every kilometer traveled, the idle silence expanded until everyone inside the vehicle felt isolated from the rest of the world. And strangely, some swore this silence had a heart, that if they listened closely, they could hear a slow, heavy beat, like a heart that should no longer be beating. That's why no one dared talk too much, laugh too much, or even breathe too loudly. Everyone knew that silence wasn't just the absence of life, it was the life of someone who should have already left. Even the most skeptical drivers knew that the most disturbing part wasn't their boarding, nor the suffocating silence it carried with it. What chilled their blood most was the final moment, when the bus reached its final stop and the passenger simply disappeared. The routine was always the same. The bus made its way through increasingly empty streets, dropping off a few passengers at stops lit by solitary streetlights. Gradually, the bus emptied until only he remained, motionless in the back, his head bowed, his body motionless. As if keeping vigil, the driver, tired, drove to the final parking lot, already waiting for the inevitable. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still there. He looked again, seconds later. He was still motionless, a figure sitting next to the window, fogged by the early morning. But all he had to do was turn off the engine, open the doors, and get up from his seat to look straight ahead. And the bench was empty. No footsteps descending the stairs, no bodies moving toward the exit. Just an abandoned space, still permeated by the heavy scent of dead flowers, like a reminder that it had indeed been there. The drivers tried to come up with an explanation. Perhaps he'd gotten off somewhere unnoticed, but there was no way. They knew every corner, every curve, every reflection in the mirror. There was no way anyone could get out unnoticed. A veteran recounted how he once parked his bus and, determined to solve the mystery, didn't take his eyes off the rearview mirror until it came to a complete stop. The passenger was there, sitting hunched over, but when he turned his head back in less than a second, the seat was empty. "He disappeared before my eyes," he repeated, his voice breaking. There was nowhere for him to go. Other drivers reported something even more disturbing. When they stopped in the parking lot, they would get out to check on the empty vehicle and find the back seat freezing cold to the touch, cold as stone exposed to the dew. One driver swore that one night he even felt pressure marks on the upholstery, as if someone had actually sat there minutes before. Ticket collectors, when they still existed on the line, refused to be the last to leave. One of them said that, while making the final check, he noticed that all the passengers had gotten off except him. He walked to the back with heavy steps, ready to ask to be let out. But when he turned the corner, he found only the empty seat and the open window, swaying slightly in the wind. The disturbing detail? No one had ever opened that window before. It was this silent disappearance that kept the legend alive. This wasn't just some stranger traveling late at night. It was something else. Something that came from elsewhere, took up space on the bus, and left when the journey ended, not through the door, but through an invisible exit. And with each disappearance, there was a clear feeling among drivers and passengers. He wasn't just leaving, he was returning to the place he should never have left. No legend is born out of thin air, and for the oldest drivers on that line, the presence of the passenger in the back wasn't just superstition. There was a story behind it, a rumor that, over time, became an indisputable truth for all who dared to drive that lonely route. They said it all began more than 20 years ago. It was a cold winter morning, the kind of night when even the streetlights seemed tired of illuminating deserted streets. A driver named Ernesto was making the last trip, taking the few remaining passengers to their destinations. The bus was nearly empty when a man boarded near the municipal cemetery. He was tall, thin, darkly dressed, and had a haggard expression like someone coming from a wake. Ernesto wasn't surprised. People returning late at night from funerals happened more often than one might imagine. The man sat in the back, as usual, but that night, something was different. The driver noticed that the man didn't get off at any stop. The entire journey, he remained there, motionless, his head down. Ernesto drove to the end of the line, turned off the engine and went to check on the vehicle. When he reached the end, he found the passenger collapsed, his body cold, his eyes open and staring blankly. He had died mid-journey alone without anyone noticing. The shock was great. They called the police, the body was removed, and the newspapers of the time reported the case. Man dies on night bus. The exact cause was never discovered. Some said it was a heart attack, others believed poisoning. But the detail that caught attention was another. No one claimed the body. No relatives appeared. The man was buried as an indigent, without a wake, without goodbyes, without a word about who he really was. And it was from that day on that the stories began. Drivers traveling the same route swore they saw a passenger identical to the dead man sitting in the back, always in the same seat. Ticket collectors smelled wilted flowers and burned candles. Passengers commented on a feeling of emptiness, as if someone were silently watching them. The elders assured him there was no doubt. That passenger had never stopped riding that line. His solitary death chained him to the back seat, repeating the same unfinished journey night after night. And to this day, his spirit wandered from journey to journey, trying to find someone willing to listen to his story. Some believed he was restless because he died without witnesses, without anyone knowing what really happened. Others said there were secrets in his death, something hidden that needed to be revealed. Either way, his presence was a reminder that the line was not just an urban path, it was also a corridor between worlds. Veteran drivers warned newbies, respect the background, don't stare, don't ask questions, just drive. And so the legend lived on, passed from mouth to mouth, always reinforced by the same inescapable detail, no matter the shift, no matter the night. He would be there waiting. For years, the unwritten rule remained. No one spoke to the passenger in the back. He would get on, sit down, remain motionless, and disappear at the final stop. It was like this, night after night, until a young student, filled with a mixture of courage and recklessness, decided to break the pact. He was a 19-year-old boy with a backpack, always the last to leave the library. Tired of hearing the whispers and legends, he swore to himself that he would find out the truth. That night, the bus was nearly empty. When the stranger boarded, as he always did, and took the seat at the back, the young man took a deep breath, ignoring the lump in his throat, and walked down the aisle until he sat 2 rows in front of him. Silence soon fell. The heavy scent of wilted flowers permeated, and the pressure in the air seemed to crush the student's chest. For minutes, he fought the urge to get up and run forward, but he remained steadfast. Then he slowly turned and asked, "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing happened. The passenger didn't move, didn't react. The young man almost laughed at himself, thinking he was delirious. But then the impossible happened. Slowly, the figure raised its head. The student was never able to describe the face clearly afterward. He said it was like looking at something covered in a living shadow, a blur that hid any human features. But what struck him most wasn't the sight. It was the voice, low, drawn out, as if coming from far away, echoing in all directions at once. "I just want to tell you how I died." The young man's blood ran cold. His voice was hoarse, almost choked, as if his throat still held the pain of his last breath. Each word was laced with suffering, but also with a plea. There was no threat, only a desperate need to be heard. The student, seized by panic, didn't respond. His body acted on its own. He jumped off the bench, ran down the hallway, and got off at the next stop, even though it was a deserted street in the middle of the night. He never took that line again. When he told the story, he said he could still hear the voice inside his head, repeating the same phrase over and over, like a curse stuck in his ears. The news spread quickly among drivers and passengers. For the first time, the passenger had spoken, and his words revealed what everyone suspected. He wasn't there by chance. He wasn't just trying to occupy the back seat. He was trapped, searching for someone brave enough to hear his latest story. After that episode, tensions rose. Many avoided the nightline. Others preferred to stand away from the back, because now they knew that at any moment he could speak again. And the fear wasn't just of what they would hear, but of what would happen if anyone actually had the courage to listen to the end. If all he wanted to do was tell how he died, what else would he reveal when he finally found the right person to listen? Time passed, but the passenger in the back never stopped appearing. Drivers changed, conductors retired, buses were refurbished, seats replaced, and even the route modernized, but none of that mattered. In the final hours, when the city lights were already dimmed and dawn fell heavily on the deserted streets, he was always there. Some said his presence was even clearer now. He no longer needed to be seen to be felt. All it took was getting on the bus and feeling the scent of wilted flowers, the pressure in your chest, the unnatural silence that swallowed all sound, to know he was in the back, motionless, waiting. The oldest ones always repeated the same phrase: "He is looking for someone." It wasn't just about occupying a bench. It was as if his soul had been trapped on that path, repeating the same ritual night after night, waiting for the right moment to be freed. The more attentive passengers noticed a pattern. He only spoke to those who dared to look back, those who broke the pact of silence and faced his presence. But none of them could bear it. They all fled, unable to hear the end, as if there were a limit the living could not cross without paying a price. Drivers commented that sometimes, when they parked their empty buses in the yard, they felt they were not alone. A whisper echoed through the dark corridor: "I just want to tell you how I died." Words that didn't stick to the bottom of the vehicle, but spread through the air, permeating every corner. And so the legend grew. Some claimed that if someone had the courage to sit beside him and hear his story through to the end, he would finally find peace. But there were also those who warned. Perhaps listening meant accepting the burden of his death. Perhaps those who listened would disappear with him, becoming part of the same shadow that held him captive. To this day, no one knows. The bench remains empty, protected by a collective instinct no passenger can break. And it remains there, night after night, the last to enter, the last to remain, until it disappears without a trace. Basically, the bus isn't just transportation. It's a corridor between worlds where the living and the dead share the same space without touching. And the passenger in the back is a reminder that some stories don't fade. They lurk, waiting for those brave enough to hear them. So if you ever catch the nightline, look back carefully. If you smell the wake, if you notice the heavy silence, know that it's there. And if by chance you hear that low voice whispering in your ear, you'll have to make a decision: run away like everyone else, or be the one who finally hears your story through to the end. But remember, they say that those who listen don't come back to tell their own story, or just the beginning, if you ever sit in the back of the bus.